The front gate alarm had not gone off. That was the first wrong thing. Fatima Reyes was standing at the kitchen sink when she noticed it. Not a sound. An absence of sound. A particular stillness that pressed against the windows of the Calloway house at 10 minutes past 11, on a night that had already felt too quiet since dinner. She had learned over 11 years that silence in this house came in different kinds. The peaceful kind settled slowly, room by room, as the evening wound down and the boy went to bed. This kind was different. This kind arrived all at once, sharp and held, like a chest that had stopped breathing. She set down the dish she was drying. Her feet were already moving. Fatima was 53 years old, a large woman with wide shoulders and hands that had been useful her entire life. She moved through the Calloway house the way she moved through everything, with quiet purpose and no wasted motion. 11 years in these halls had made the floor plan part of her body. She knew which step on the back staircase creaked on the left side and was silent on the right. She knew that the third window in the east corridor latched loosely and rattled when the wind came from the north. She knew the boy's room had 4 feet between the door and the bed, and that when Owen Calloway was afraid, he went very still and very silent, which made him harder to find, not easier. She knew all of this before she was fully aware she was running. Owen was 10 years old, and had been 10 years old for exactly 3 months. He was a careful, serious child, who organized his football trading cards every Sunday, with the concentration of a scientist, who ate his food in a specific order from least to most favorite, and who had not cried in front of another person since the funeral of his mother 3 years ago, though Fatima had heard him, twice, on Tuesday nights through the wall between his room and the linen cupboard where she sometimes folded laundry late. She had never mentioned it to him. She had simply appeared in the kitchen both of those nights, warm milk already on the stove, and said nothing when he patted in, 10 minutes later in his socks, and sat at the counter and stared at the wall until the thing inside him quieted. That was how she loved him, without announcement, without condition, without asking him to perform gratitude or name what he was feeling or be anything other than exactly what he was. She was 3 steps from his door when the window at the end of the corridor exploded inward. Glass hit the floor in a sound like a broken instrument. Cold air poured through the gap. Owen cried out from inside his room, a short, shocked sound that he cut off almost immediately, which was worse than if he had kept going. She did not stop. She hit the door with her shoulder, had it open in one motion, crossed the 4 feet to the bed in 2 steps, and found him halfway off the mattress, frozen, his football cards scattered across the floor, where he had knocked the shoebox in the chaos, his eyes fixed on the broken window in the wall across from him. She grabbed him by the shoulders. She said his name once. His eyes found hers. "Under the bed," she said. "Now. Do not come out." She pushed him down and back. She heard him go. She heard the shoebox scrape against the floor as he pulled it with him, which was the most Owen Calloway thing she had ever witnessed, and even in that moment it steadied her. She stood up. She turned to the door. 3 men were in the corridor. She could see them through the gap. They were moving fast and low, and they were not wearing uniforms of any kind that belonged to this house. The security team's alarm system was finally screaming from somewhere downstairs, too late, too far away, and the men in the corridor were already close. She stepped into the doorframe. She was a large woman. She filled the space. She set her feet, and she did not move, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her even as it arrived, that she was not afraid. She was simply certain. The kind of certain that does not come from being brave. It comes from knowing, without argument, what you are for. The first shot came, then the second. She did not move. Third, fourth. She was on her knees by the fourth, but her hands were on the doorframe, and she was still in the doorway, and the fifth came, and she felt it land, and the corridor went loud, and then louder, and then George Calloway's security team was there, finally, flooding the hallway from both ends, and the men who had come through the window were gone, or down, and the house was full of shouting and running feet. She heard Owen's voice from under the bed. He was saying her name, quietly, steadily, like a metronome, like a child who had decided that if he kept saying it, she would have to stay. She stayed. She was still in the doorframe when the paramedics reached her, still with one hand on the wood, and the lead paramedic later told a colleague that he had never, in 14 years of emergency response, seen anything like it. He could not explain what was holding her up. She could not explain it either. She only knew that the room behind her was safe, and the boy inside it was still saying her name, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. George Calloway had been in the middle of a phone call in his study on the other side of the house when the alarm went off. He dropped the phone. By the time he reached the east corridor, his security team had it contained, and Fatima was being lowered carefully to the floor by two paramedics, who were speaking to her in low, controlled voices, and Owen was out from under the bed and on his knees beside her, his hand wrapped around hers, his football cards still clutched in his other fist because he had brought them out with him, which was the first thing George noticed, and the thing he thought about later, in the hospital, in the particular way that the mind grabs small details when it cannot hold the large ones. George Calloway was not a man who showed his interior life easily. His profession did not allow for it. He had spent 20 years building a reputation for stillness, for measured responses, for never giving an opponent the advantage of knowing what moved him. He had buried a wife. He had managed catastrophes that would have destroyed other men. He had sat in rooms where the wrong word meant irreversible consequences, and kept his voice level and his face calm. He looked at Fatima Reyes on the floor of his son's corridor, and something in him broke open so fast and so completely that he had to turn his face away. He composed himself in 3 seconds. He had trained himself to do it in 3 seconds. He turned back. He took Owen by the shoulders, gently, and moved him aside so the paramedics could work. And Owen let himself be moved without resistance, which meant the boy was in shock, which meant there was another crisis to manage, alongside the one already underway. George sat beside his son on the corridor floor. He put his arm around him. Owen leaned against him without a word. They sat like that while the paramedics worked, while the house came back to itself slowly, noise settling into order, lights coming on in every room, while the gurney appeared from downstairs and the paramedics prepared to move her, and Owen watched every moment of it with the focused silence of a child who has decided that witnessing something completely is a form of loyalty. George followed the ambulance in his car. He had not made this decision consciously. He was simply in the car, and then the car was moving, and his driver did not ask where they were going because it was obvious. He sat in a hospital waiting area with plastic chairs and a coffee machine that charged too much and dispensed too little, and he waited. His security lead offered twice to make calls, to arrange better accommodations, to handle the situation. George told him to handle the house and said nothing else. He waited in the plastic chair. The surgical team came out just before 4 in the morning. 4 bullets removed successfully. The 5th had lodged in a position that made removal more dangerous than leaving it in place. She was stable. She was, the surgeon said, with the specific professional respect that doctors reserve for patients who have genuinely startled them, remarkably strong. She would recover. George thanked the surgeon. He sat back down. He looked at the ceiling of the waiting room for a while. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the way Owen had started eating properly in the 3rd month after Fatima arrived, and how George had noticed, but had not connected the cause and effect immediately, because he admitted to himself now, the kind of man who noticed results without always understanding their roots. He thought about the warm milk he had once seen her setting on the counter at 2 in the morning, and the way she had moved in the kitchen as though the late hour was no imposition at all. He thought about the Sunday afternoon card sorting. He thought about the way his son looked at her, with the particular ease of a child who had found his fixed point. He thought about the doorway. He had seen the corridor footage. He had stood in his study and watched it on a small screen held by his security lead, and he had watched Fatima Reyes walk to his son's door and stand in it, and he had watched what happened next, and he had said nothing, and his security lead had had the wisdom to say nothing either. And after a long moment, George had handed the device back and walked to the window and stood there looking at the garden for a while. He did not have language for what he had seen. He did not try to find it. He went back to the plastic chair and waited for morning. Owen was in the room when she woke up. Of course he was. George had arranged it, but Owen would have arranged it himself if George had not gotten there first. The boy had a way of making his presence felt in situations without asking permission, which was something he had gotten, George thought, from his mother, who had also believed that being somewhere was sometimes more important than being invited. Fatima opened her eyes slowly. The room was pale and bright, and smelled like hospitals always smell, clean in a way that has nothing to do with comfort. She turned her head, and Owen was in the chair beside her bed, his shoebox on his lap, 3 cards laid out across the arm of the chair, in an arrangement she immediately identified as alphabetical by team name, which meant he had been sitting there long enough to reorganize twice. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You brought the cards," she said. Her voice came out lower than she expected, rougher, like something that had been set aside for a while. "I didn't know how long we'd be here," he said. "Reasonable," she said. He looked down at the cards and then back at her. His face was doing the thing it did when he had many feelings, and was sorting them in order of which one was safest to let out first. She had seen that expression hundreds of times. She had learned to wait for it to finish. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I did." He pressed his lips together. He looked at the cards. He picked one up and examined it and set it down again. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. And that was the full extent of the conversation they had about the doorway. Now and, she suspected, forever. It did not need to be longer. Between two people who understood each other, at the level they understood each other, the right words were always the shortest ones. George came in that afternoon. He stood in the hospital room doorway in a dark coat, his hair less organized than she had ever seen it, with shadows under his eyes that told her he had not slept in something approaching 24 hours. He looked at Owen and the cards and at Fatima in the bed, and something moved through his face so quickly she might have missed it if she had not spent 11 years learning to read him. He pulled the second chair to the other side of the bed. He sat down. Owen dealt him a card without being asked, the way he dealt cards to Fatima when she was sitting nearby. A casual gesture of inclusion that required no comment. George took the card and looked at it. It was a goalkeeper from a northern city team, photographed mid-dive, arms fully extended. George set it on the bed rail. No one spoke for a while. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and caught the dust in the air, and the room was warm, and Fatima felt, through the ache of the recovery and the strange weight of the 5th bullet that the doctors had said she would carry permanently, something settle in the room that she could not name precisely but recognized. It was the feeling of 3 people who knew each other in the way that only time and proximity and real emergency can teach people to know each other, not performing comfort, actually in it. She was discharged from the hospital on the 9th day, against the preferences of 2 of her 3 attending physicians. But she had made her case clearly and calmly, and with the polite immovability of a woman who had spent 5 decades making decisions about her own body, and was not interested in renegotiating that practice. George drove her home. Owen sat beside her in the back seat with his shoebox, and talked about 3 different football card trades he had been considering for the past week, and wanted her opinion on. She gave her opinions. He weighed them. He disagreed with one, and agreed with the other 2. The trade negotiations were ongoing. The house was waiting. She walked through the front door and stood in the entrance hall for a moment, the same hall she had walked through for 11 years, the same dark wood floors and high ceilings and smell of old furniture, and, underneath it, the faint smell of the kitchen because she had always kept the kitchen door open and the house had absorbed it. It smelled like her work. She stood there and breathed it in and thought about the difference between a place you work and a place you belong, and how those 2 things are not always separated by as much distance as people assume. Owen had already disappeared upstairs to begin the overdue Sunday card reorganization he had postponed for 9 days. George was standing a few feet behind her. "Welcome home," he said. She turned around. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. They stood in the entrance hall for a moment, and then she went to the kitchen to see what needed to be done, which was her way of being in any space, finding the thing that needed attention and attending to it, not because she was required to, but because it was what she did, and what she did was what she was, and she had long ago stopped apologizing for the simplicity of that. He asked her on a Tuesday. Owen had gone to get something from the vending machine down the corridor. The boy had developed a dedicated relationship with a specific brand of crackers that the hospital had stocked during her recovery, and had subsequently located a supply of them in a shop near the house, and now treated the acquisition of these crackers as a standing personal priority, which Fatima found both inexplicable and perfectly consistent with his character. George waited until Owen's footsteps disappeared down the corridor. He sat forward in his chair. He said, "I would like to ask you something." Fatima looked at him. She already knew, the way she knew most things in that house, not through any mystical ability, but through 11 years of reading the temperature of rooms and the set of shoulders and the particular quality of silences. "I want to marry you," George said. "I am asking if you will consider it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine and caught her off guard with its own force. It pulled at something in her side, and she pressed her hand there, and laughed anyway, because the laugh was bigger than the discomfort. "George," she said, "I mean it. I know you mean it. Is that a no?" "That is a very definite no." He absorbed this. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing something away rather than accepting it. "All right," he said. He asked again on the 14th day, quietly, between other things, as though the question were a natural continuation of a conversation they had been having about something else entirely. She said no again, without unkindness. He nodded again, the same filing away nod. He brought her soup from a place down the street that Owen had declared superior to all other soup in the known world, with the absolute authority of a person who had tried soup in exactly 4 establishments, and considered this a complete data set. She ate the soup. It was very good. She thought about the no. She thought about what the no was made of. It was not made of indifference. She was not indifferent to George Calloway. She had not been indifferent to him for some years, if she was honest with herself. And honesty with herself had always been the one practice she refused to let slide regardless of how inconvenient it was. It was not made of doubt about his sincerity. She had read him for 11 years and she knew the difference between a man performing an emotion and a man who had been overtaken by one. It was made, she realized slowly, of the belief that a woman like her did not receive an offer like this, and that a woman who did not believe she deserved it would always find reasons to say no. She sat with that for a long time. On the morning of the 21st day, Owen climbed onto the bed beside her. He had developed this habit during the recovery and had not been discouraged from it because neither she nor George had been able to find a sufficient reason to discourage it. He settled himself on the side away from the 5th bullet because he had noticed, early, which side she favored, and had adjusted without comment, and the noticing and adjusting was so Owen that she had to look at the wall for a moment when she first registered it. He lay with his head on the pillow beside her, and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, without looking at her, "I want you to stay." "I am staying," she said. "Not like how you stay now," he said. "Like, officially, so it's in writing and no one can change it." She said nothing. "I know you always stay," he said. "You've always stayed, but I want it to be the kind of staying that doesn't depend on a job or on my dad deciding something. I want it to depend on you deciding." She turned her head and looked at the ceiling. The 5th bullet made its familiar weight known. It had stopped feeling like an intrusion. It was simply part of her architecture now, a thing she had earned and kept. "Okay," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. "Yeah?" "Yes," she said. "I'll stay officially." He nodded. He looked back at the ceiling. After a moment he said, "I'm going to finish my orange crackers now," and climbed off the bed and picked up his crackers and went back to his chair. And that was that. George came in an hour later. She told him yes before he could ask again. He stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down. He said, "Are you certain?" "I have been certain about most things I've decided in my life," she said. "I am certain about this." He reached across and took her hand. He held it. He did not speak. She let him hold it. Outside, in the corridor, they could hear Owen explaining something to a passing nurse about the specific qualities that made his brand of crackers superior to all other crackers, with the patient, detailed authority of a person who had thought about this at length and was delighted to share his conclusions. George looked at the door and then at Fatima, and he smiled. A full and genuine smile, the kind she had only seen a handful of times in 11 years, the kind that belonged to a different George Calloway than the one most people encountered. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They were married on a Saturday morning in early spring. The garden was the right choice. Owen had argued for the garden from the beginning, firmly and without flexibility, on the grounds that the house indoors was too formal, and the hotel his father had briefly considered was, in Owen's precise words, not the point. The garden was the point. The garden was where they had spent summer evenings, and where Owen had learned to ride a bicycle with Fatima, walking alongside him, and where the three of them had eaten dinner on warm nights at the table near the rose border that the previous groundskeeper had planted, and the current one maintained with great personal commitment. The garden was home. The garden was where it should be. He was right, and everyone knew he was right, so the garden it was. The morning was cool and clear, with the particular clean light that early spring holds before the heat of the year arrives and softens everything. The pine trees along the property line were still. The iron gates were closed. The small group of guests had assembled quietly and were standing in a loose arrangement near the rose border, the kind of people who had been selected not for their social position or their usefulness, but for the specific quality of having always been reliable, always been discreet, and always been genuinely attached to the people at the center of this story. Owen was wearing a suit. He had very strong opinions about the suit. He had been measured for it 3 weeks earlier, and had expressed detailed preferences at every stage of the process, which the tailor had received with good-natured professionalism. The suit was navy. The shirt was white. The tie, which he had been promised he could choose entirely on his own, was deep blue with small silver dots, and he wore it with the focused gravity of a person who understood that a tie was a serious thing and should be treated accordingly. He was the ring-bearer. He understood the weight of the responsibility. He had rehearsed it. He had practiced walking with appropriate ceremony across the kitchen 3 times the evening before, holding a small object at the correct height, and Fatima had watched from the stove with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, which was her way of being deeply moved. The officiant was a compact man in a gray suit who spoke in a calm and measured voice and who had, in Fatima's brief conversation with him the day before, demonstrated the most important quality she required in anyone performing a ceremony: the ability to understand that what was happening was real, not decorative, and should be treated as such. George stood at the center of the garden path in a dark suit and a gray tie. He was, Fatima thought as she walked toward him, not a man who looked different in moments of significance. He looked exactly like himself. That was what she had always respected about him. He had never required the moment to elevate him. He was already what he was. She walked toward him without a trembling step or a held breath, or any of the performances that ceremony often required of people. She walked toward him the way she walked through the house at 6 in the morning, purposefully, without ceremony, knowing exactly where she was going and why. She was wearing a dress of deep green silk that her sister had helped her choose, which had involved 4 shops and a significant quantity of opinions, and 2 cups of strong coffee, and a disagreement about hemlines that had been resolved by Fatima simply choosing the hem she preferred, which was also the correct hem, and which her sister had conceded, after a brief silence, was the correct hem. She stood beside George. She looked at him. He looked at her. The officiant began to speak. Owen was standing 2 feet to her left, holding the small box that contained the ring, with the posture of a person performing a duty that he took absolutely seriously. He was watching the officiant with close attention. He wanted to know exactly when his moment would come so that he was ready for it and not caught out. His moment came. He opened the box. He extended it toward his father. George reached for the ring. Owen dropped the box. It made a small sound on the garden path. The ring remained inside the box. Owen looked down at it. He looked at the officiant. He bent, picked up the box, retrieved the ring, examined it briefly to confirm it was undamaged, and held it out to his father, with restored composure. George took it without comment. Owen stepped back. George put the ring on Fatima's finger. She felt the weight of it. cool metal against her skin. A small, permanent thing that changed nothing and everything simultaneously. She said yes when the moment for yes arrived. She said it in a voice that was even and clear and completely her own, and she meant it the way she had meant the doorway, the way she meant the early mornings and the warm milk and the Sunday card reorganizations, and the 11 years of being exactly where she was needed without needing to be asked. She meant it from the place underneath everything, where the real decisions live. George said yes, too. His voice was steady. His eyes were a different matter. Owen clapped once, caught himself, looked at the officiant to confirm the appropriateness of applause, received a small approving nod, and clapped again. The guests followed his lead. The garden filled with sound, and the spring air moved through the pine trees along the wall, and somewhere in the city beyond the iron gates, the world was going on as it always did, without knowledge of this garden, or these people, or what had just been settled here. The newspapers found out 22 days later. Someone had talked, which was always how it went regardless of how carefully these things were arranged, because there are always more people in any story than the people at its center believe, and information has its own way of moving through the world whether you want it to or not. The stories used many different words. George's lawyer compiled them without being asked, out of what Fatima suspected was a professional combination of thoroughness and quiet outrage on her behalf. She glanced at the summary he produced. She saw the words unlikely, unconventional, surprising, difficult to understand, and, in the headline of one particularly committed outlet, simply bizarre. She set the summary down. She did not read further. Her sister called and read several headlines aloud with an expression in her voice that managed to be simultaneously offended, amused, and quietly triumphant, which was a combination that only her sister could produce. Fatima listened, agreed where agreement was warranted, and said she would call back later, which she did. George's lawyers released a brief statement through the appropriate channels. George himself said nothing publicly, which was what he had always done in response to things that were not the public's business, and had always been his most effective strategy. Owen read one article on his tablet, closed it, and said, with the measured calm of a 10-year-old who had decided to be very adult about something, "They don't know anything about us." Then he went back to his cards. Fatima was in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, which was where she always was. The coffee was on. The kettle had just finished. The kitchen held the particular quality of light that came through the east window in early spring mornings, low and gold and long, falling across the counters in strips that she had watched for 11 years and had never stopped finding good. Owen's football cards were on the refrigerator door. Not all of them. A rotating selection that he updated according to a system only he fully understood, held in place by a small collection of magnets that had accumulated over the years from various sources, including a round yellow one from a beach trip, a square red one that said something about a city she had never visited, and a small llama-shaped one she had bought from a market stall 4 months ago because it had made her smile when she saw it. Her magnet now, on her refrigerator now, in her kitchen. The difference between those 3 phrases and the phrases she would have used 11 years ago, or even 11 months ago, was not a small difference. It was the difference between a person who belongs somewhere and a person who works there. And those 2 things, while they can occupy the same physical space, do not feel the same from the inside. She had always known how to be the second. She was learning, slowly, deliberately, and without rushing the process, how to be the first. George came in while she was cracking eggs. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her standing at the stove and he said, "You know you genuinely do not need to do this." "I know," she said. "I mean it. We have a cook now. We have had a cook for 3 weeks." "I know," she said. She cracked a second egg. "The cook makes very good food." "She does. I make better eggs." A pause. "You do," George said. He sat at the kitchen table and picked up his coffee, which was already made, and already exactly how he liked it, because she had made it before he came down, which he knew, and she knew, and neither of them discussed. Owen arrived in 43 seconds, which was within his usual range. He was in his pajamas. His hair was making independent decisions in at least 3 directions. He had 3 football cards in his hand, which he had apparently retrieved from the shoebox before coming downstairs, because being awake and not having cards accessible was not a situation he was willing to tolerate. He climbed onto his stool. Second from the left. Always the second from the left. He put the cards on the counter. Fatima slid a plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, orange juice, poured. He looked at the plate. He looked at the cards. He looked at her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He began to eat. He ate in his particular order, which had not changed in 3 years. She turned back to the stove and started on George's portion. The kitchen made its morning sounds. The coffee maker ticked as it cooled. The window above the sink showed the garden, still in the early light, dew on the rose border, the pine trees unmoved. George was reading something from the previous evening that had arrived in a folder his assistant had left for him. He read with his coffee cup held in his right hand, not quite drinking, just holding, which was a habit she had noticed years ago, and that she had never mentioned, because it was not the kind of thing that needed to be mentioned but simply known. She knew it. She knew which step creaked on the back staircase. She knew which nightmare came on which nights. She knew the 4 minutes he stood at the window every morning, and what it meant when it stretched to 5. She knew that Owen reorganized his cards when he was processing something difficult, the same way other children might pace or cry or talk it through, and that the reorganization was his version of settling himself, and it should be left alone until it was finished. She knew the house. She knew its people. She had earned this knowledge slowly, over years, with consistency and patience and genuine care, and the knowledge had built itself into something that was not work, and not duty, but simply love, expressed in the only language she had ever found fully reliable, which was being there. She slid George's plate onto the table. He looked up. He said thank you. He said it the way he said everything, simply, without performance, meaning it. She went back to the stove. She wiped down the surface. She refilled her own coffee. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at the garden and the morning and the iron gates at the far end of the property, closed and still. The 5th bullet was quiet today. It was not always quiet. Some mornings it reminded her of itself with a persistence she had learned to simply accept, the way she accepted most things that were permanent, not fighting them, not pretending they were not there, but building her life around them, with the practical intelligence of a woman who had always understood the difference between what could be changed and what could not. She had been shot 5 times, and she was standing in her kitchen on a spring morning, watching her son eat eggs in his pajamas, while her husband read the morning briefing, and the garden held the early light. The 5th bullet could say what it liked. She had already won. Owen pushed one of his 3 cards across the counter toward her, without looking up from his plate. "Here," he said. She picked it up. A midfielder, dark-haired, photographed mid-run, eyes fixed on something beyond the frame of the picture, with the total concentration of a person who knew exactly where they were going. "He's a double," Owen said. "Thank you," she said. She crossed to the refrigerator. She found a space between the yellow beach magnet and the llama. She pressed the card against the door. It held. She looked at the refrigerator for a moment, the cards and the magnets and the small accumulation of things that belonged to a life that was fully hers now, not borrowed, not conditional, not dependent on anything she had not herself chosen. She went back to the stove. Behind her, Owen refilled his own juice with the solemn self-sufficiency of a child who was not going to ask for help with something he could do himself, which was very him, which was very theirs. George turned a page. The coffee maker ticked. The garden held the morning light. Fatima stood at the stove in her kitchen on the first ordinary day of the rest of her life, and did not call it a miracle or a fairy tale or anything the newspapers had reached for, because it was not any of those things. It was simply what happened when a person showed up, every day, without condition, for 11 years, and refused to leave, and meant it. That was the whole story. She had known it all along.